Chapter 8 Occultism. It lasts only 1,000 years. During the age of occultism, mankind is plunged into a world of unreality. Mankind begins to direct its tremendous store of diverse energies toward made-up images and abstract worlds existing beyond the boundaries of real life. The real world, with its diversity, receives less and less of the life-creating warmth of man. It maintains its existence only at the expense of past accumulation and its original charge from the divine. Mankind ceases to fulfill its main purpose. It becomes dangerous for the universe, and planetary-scale disasters take place. Today, all mankind still lives in the world of the occult, but that age ended in the year 2000. Of course, in reality, the name 2000 is a misnomer. You know yourself that only recently the traditional year count was radically changed. The latest temporal borderline represented the millionth anniversary of civilization on the Earth. And as always, a global disaster was slated to happen. More specifically, mankind was supposed to launch a new attempt toward populating the universe through its own perfection. But no disaster occurred during any year of the occult age. It took only 3 of the Vedic people who were not asleep to partially remove the soporific occult spells from people today. Remember how the hearts of those reading your books began to flutter and recall their love for the earth? They are still asleep, but the power of God's Vedic culture is coming back to them, and God is gaining new hope. While still not fully awake, they, through their love, averted a disaster. Now it will not happen on our planet. Soon all people will come out of the hypnotic occult sleep. They will start coming back to reality. Are you surprised that mankind today is either asleep, under a hypnotic spell, or dwelling in an unreal world? You might wonder, how can that be? Here I am. And in the cities, both large and small, there are millions of people living. Cars go up and down the streets. You should not be all that surprised by my words, Vladimir. Think about it and judge for yourself. At what times, on what day, or at what hour do people actually live in the real world? Think, for example, how many different religions there are on the globe. They all have a different interpretation of man's being and the order of the universe, and each has its own set of rituals distinct from the others. Let us say that there is indeed one religion which is truer than all the rest. But that would mean that all the worlds the rest of them are creating are unreal. But after all, people believe in them too. And if they believe, they live in submission to the laws of the unreal world. All over the earth, greater and greater numbers of people are wanting to have more money. But what is money? It is simply a convention. People think that everything can be bought with money. That is an illusion. No amount of money can buy the true energy of love, or a mother's feelings, or one's motherland, or the taste of fruit intended only for the one who grew it with mindful attention. As a convention, money can be used only to buy conventional, conditional love, along with a multitude of soulless things around. But in the process, you are dooming your soul to a state of loneliness. In the occult millennium, mankind is completely disoriented as to the space created by God, and people's souls simply flounder about as though in darkness. Look closely, Vladimir. Just over the past 100 years, in the country where you live, look how society has kept changing its direction. There was a Tsar. The social elite functioned according to prescribed behavioral rites, and people of prominence were decorated with various emblems, medals, and orders, and colored ribbons. They wore gold-embroidered uniforms, and monasteries and temples were built throughout the country where you live now. And then, all of a sudden, that was considered contemptible. Uniforms, medals, and the ribbons attached to them came to be considered no more than clown outfits. Temples were part of the Dark Ages. Those who served in temples were called swindlers, and people enthusiastically sacked the temples and angrily slew the occult servers therein. Later it was announced to all that only the Soviet authorities were to blame. Yes, the authorities did officially encourage the people to do this, but then the people did not protest. They simply responded to the call of their ruling idols. After all, you know from documents existing today how in Kuban 42 Christian priests were brutally slaughtered. Not just killed, but brutally tortured. Their bodies were tossed in cesspools. This was not just the work of the rulers. The people themselves willingly participated in such acts. The rulers' only role was to allow them to happen. As a result, priests were slain by the thousands in different parts of the country. The ones that could not run ended up renouncing their faith. Very few in those times managed to save both their life and their faith. The majority of the people in the country became sincere atheists. They changed their clothes. The emblems, the ribbons on their uniforms became different, with different colors. Many analysts and historians have written books about the Soviet years, but in the future, Lenin and Stalin will be remembered for just one thing. For the first time, mankind has been shown clearly that occultism is obsolete. Even in their sleep, people do not accept occult religions. Occultism is supported only by artifice and force. But, you see, it was not their faith in God that was destroyed. It was only the occultism that had infested their faith that was brought down. Over the past millennium in Russia alone, a startling change of philosophy has managed to occur among the people as a whole. Religion became significantly denigrated, and people's faith in it was transferred to communism, though that too is a faith. Quite recently you saw yourself how once again the people in the country where you live sharply changed their direction. The path everybody in the country had been enthusiastically following was declared to be the wrong one, and priorities changed once more. Did the people choose a new way? No way. The path is not at all clear to the people. In the unreal world of the occult, the people do not choose their own path. Someone always points it out. But who? The high priest, who still today rules the world. How does he rule the people of the modern world? And why can nobody ever overthrow him? Where is he located? Take a look. I can show him to you. The priest who still rules the world today. Now you see an elderly man. Do not be surprised at his modest appearance. In terms of clothing and behavior, he is indistinguishable from most other people, and as you can see, he is surrounded by ordinary things. And his house is not that big. His staff comprises just 2 servants. He has a family, a wife, and 2 sons. But even his family do not know who he actually is. And yet he does have one outward distinguishing feature. If you observe him closely, you can see that he spends the whole day in isolation. And on his face, you can see the depth of his meditation. Whenever he eats or talks with his wife, although their conversations are rather rare, his eyes look as though they are concealed behind a foggy film. And even when he watches television, his eyelids are slightly lowered. He never shows surprise and never laughs. In fact, he hardly watches any television at all. He merely pretends to watch, and during this time he is deep in intensive thought. He is working out grandiose plans and exercising control of events in whole countries. He is the high priest from a dynasty of priests, having inherited from them a knowledge of the occult, which he will also be able to transmit to one of his sons. It will take him just a year to convey everything orally to his successor, whom he is training in secret without his even knowing it. The priest has long been developing specific abilities within his son. All the world's money belongs to the high priest. All the world's money works for him, including what you have in your pocket right now. Do not be surprised. I shall show you how this happens, and by what means, and for what reason the high priest prefers not to live in a castle surrounded by an army of guards, why he prefers commonplace routines to special luxury. The high priest has no bodyguards because he knows perfectly well that the more visible authority is to all, the greater the need for armed protection. Besides, there's no guarantee that any number of bodyguards, even hundreds of thousands, will succeed in protecting any earthly ruler. Indeed, there have been instances where the guards themselves betray or even kill the ruler. Besides, having bodyguards may entail a lot of problems. There are times when the ruler is compelled to submit to the guard's terms, compelled to tell the guards about his intentions, forthcoming trips, for example. With a bodyguard, a ruler is always under observation, and so meditation becomes more difficult for him. It is much simpler and much more reliable to conceal one's identity. This also wards off intrigues on the part of one's adversaries, fanatics, and challengers to one's authority. Now you may well be thinking, but how is it possible to control huge numbers of people without assistants, managers, and deputies, without drafting laws and disciplines those who fail to carry them out, and disciplining those who fail to carry them out? It is all very straightforward. The vast majority of people have been immersed in occultism for a very long time. The high priest knows all the tricks of occultism. He does not have assistants, managers, drafters of laws, prisons, and executioners. He has armies and commanders, though not a single one of those who carry out his missions has any suspicion himself of who is secretly commanding him and by what means the orders are issued. It is a simple system of control without visible and personal contact. In cities both large and small of any country, there are people who all at once start to hear voices from a source they cannot pin down. And this voice from an unknown source may order a man to carry out some kind of action, and the man obeys the order. Sometimes there is a clear, audible voice. Sometimes this man does not know himself what is happening to him. It is just that he feels some kind of attraction within, and he carries out the action ordered. This kind of phenomenon is known to modern science. Psychiatrists, along with other scientists, have been attempting to study it for a long time, but to no avail. Modern science classifies this kind of phenomenon as a type of mental disorder. People who go to doctors and report hearing voices coming out of nowhere and giving them orders are invariably carted off to a hospital. What kind of hospital? A psychiatric institution. In many countries, these are very much like prisons. There are a great many of them today in America, Europe, and Russia. Patients are treated with all sorts of pills and injections to quiet the mind. This dulls their sensations, making them sleep a lot and become extremely sluggish. And some of these people stop hearing voices as such. Others feign cure in an attempt to procure their release. But not everyone who hears voices will go to see a doctor. Just imagine now that someone submitting to a voice command is in charge of an atomic missile, or in command of an army, or assigned to guard a container of deadly bacteria, and this voice then gives him a bizarre order. Science has not been able to define the exact nature of this unusual phenomenon. It definitely exists today, and they are afraid to publicize it. But that does not help. In the meantime, they should have been focusing their attention on something more basic. If there is a signal receiver, there must somewhere be a signal transmitter as well. The high priest and his assistants know how to transmit voice commands. They also know what kind of man each of the many religions is capable of shaping. The priests are the originators of these religions, of occultism itself. They need it in order to control people. The fanatic who believes in the unreal world is like a biorobot predisposed to hear the voice commands and to carry out any order unquestioningly. The high priest and his assistants know how to set people at odds with each other and start wars among people of different faiths. Wars may have different specific causes, but in any war the basic weaponry has consisted of discrepancies in people's beliefs. All technology and all artificial information channels are similarly controlled by the priests through the people. And for this, they do not have to control every television broadcast themselves or look over every reporter's shoulder as he writes. They need only create a general condition whereby all media are out to make money. Television advertising, for example, has become more and more sophisticated, intrusive, and aggressive. Any psychologist will tell you that it is nothing less than aggressive mental suggestion aimed at individual viewers. often not to their benefit, but to their harm. People are shamelessly told that commercial advertising cannot be helped. That is what pays for the programs people watch. But then every TV viewer pays for all these adverts by purchasing products at the suggestion of the advertisers. Advertising costs are included in the retail price of the product. What can be more sorry than a situation like that? And money acts as a huge and powerful lever for the priest's influence. I told you that even the money you have in your pocket right now serves the high priest. Here is how it all happens. A simple pattern may be observed in the convoluted banking system we have. Money withdrawn by someone from a bank increases the bank's capital. For example, let us say Russia, as a country, borrows on credit from an international bank. It is then obliged to pay back with considerable interest, much more than it originally borrowed. How is the difference made up? From the taxes you pay, or let us say, even when a pensioner buys a quarter kilo of bread, a tax is also included as a percentage of the price, and that percentage, or at least part of it, goes to the international bank. Thus capital flourishes, but whose? The high priest's. Without even touching the capital himself, he is able to direct the flow of money into wars, occult activities, or the production of deadly medicines. His goal is simple. Pride dominates in him, and it constantly aspires to create its own world, distinct from the world God made, and hold it in subjection. And the priests partially succeed in achieving the objectives they desire. People's concerns about their everyday lives are a great help to them in this, and they themselves stir up concerns among the people to distract them. Note how when people are distracted by everyday concerns, they do not notice that less and less information is being provided them. There are stricter and stricter prohibitions on bringing up the one basic question: is the path to which all mankind is now aspiring the right one? If they could only free themselves from distraction, many might be able to come to a conclusion for themselves, seeing how every year diseases are on the rise, wars are not ceasing, and each day brings greater and greater disasters. The path we are on is doubtful, to say the least. But oh, the distractions! They do not allow for any kind of contemplation. The priest, on the other hand, is engaged minute by minute in meditation, creating designs and having them carried out by the hands of millions of people. I spent a long time listening to Anastasia's emotional narrative. I refrained from interrupting her or asking her for a clarification along the way. This time I stayed longer than usual in the taiga. As I was leaving, I realized I was suffering from information overload and that it would be difficult for me to set everything down in a book. Besides, the things she said were so extraordinary, raising questions about religion and authority. In our religious denominations today, there are a great many fanatics, all kinds of them. They are ready to go after anyone who encroaches on their beliefs. What do I need these problems for? Chapter 9. A Need to Think. After I got home and was preparing this book to submit to the publisher, I couldn't decide, even up to the last moment, whether or not I should include all of Anastasia's sayings in the manuscript. When Anastasia spoke of a splendid future for Russia, which could be realized through the establishment of family domains, everything she said made sense. Her idea quickly caught on among my readers. People began to act. Then, in the book, Who Are We?, when in an emotional answer to the question she referred to Christ Jesus as her older brother, and I wrote about it, a number of readers, mainly faithful Christians, began to object. In the book before that, I had written how, in answer to my questions as to whether she might name any clerics who could understand her, she replied that Pope John Paul II would help her. This prompted fresh doubts on the part of a few Catholic readers. Such sayings of hers left me with a constant series of doubts of my own. Should I write in my books about Anastasia's unusual actions, words, and behaviors? Are they beneficial or harmful? Will they not cause some readers to entertain doubts about the obvious practical ideas of transforming society through the improvement of living conditions and way of life on the part of individual families? Besides, I wasn't completely free of doubt in regard to the content of her sayings. Now I ask you, what am I to make of phrases like Jesus Christ's sister or Pope John Paul II will help. If you look through the Bible, there is no mention anywhere that Jesus had any brothers or sisters. And then, all at once, there occurred an event that could be called super-sensational, and in connection with this, Anastasia's unusual sayings again and again gave me pause for reflecting on the tremendous scope of man's true possibilities. This is what happened. All at once I heard that the Vatican had publicized sources mentioning two of Christ Jesus' sisters. Only I don't remember whether they were sisters or cousins. I heard this brief news report while I was alone in my apartment, taking care of some routine tasks. The radio and the television were both on at the time, and so I can't say for certain where I heard it. I think it may have been the TV news. After hearing this, each time I sat down at my desk, I couldn't help picking up my notes with Anastasia's unusual sayings, which I had previously decided not to include in the new book. Now I was having second thoughts about whether I had made the right choice. Among these sayings, there was this one in particular. The American President George Bush, in a highly unconventional move without being aware of it himself, will save his country from a terrible disaster and protect the world from a war unprecedented in its potential destructive influence over the whole earth. Following the disastrous acts of terrorism in America on the 11th of September 2001, and the subsequent military operation, war, in fact, in Afghanistan with direct American involvement, this saying of Anastasia's seemed to completely contradict what actually happened. However, upon analyzing the information available in the press and on the TV, I became more and more convinced that the events of September 11th in America could help people uncover a major mystery, could help head off even larger-scale global acts of terrorism in various countries of the world. And they will be averted only providing this secret is exposed. Again and again I will read over Anastasia's extraordinary sayings, and here is what I discovered. On the 11th of September 2001 in the United States of America, there occurred a series of large-scale acts of terrorism. Several jets with passengers aboard took off with unknown pilots from New York airports and immediately altered their scheduled flight path. One after the other, the planes tore into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, along with other strategic targets. Over and over again, gruesome images of the crashes lit up the TV screens all over the world. Soon afterward, Osama bin Laden and his organization were declared to have masterminded the attack. A little while later, the American president and government secured the support of a number of European countries and Russia and began bombing Afghanistan, where, according to available intelligence, the chief culprit and members of his organization were hiding out. So then, what is the mystery here? After all, images of the results of these terrorist attacks and the ongoing anti-terrorist military operation were shown many times over and are still being used in TV news clips several times a day. The mystery lies in the complete absence or cover-up of the causes of the acts of terrorism, in the complete absence of logic, not on the part of those who carried them out, but on those who thought them up. The mystery lies in the fact that the press didn't even try to make even a halfway significant analysis of the causes of what happened, as though somehow all the mass media had been issued an injunction not to investigate them. What we see and hear in the media on a daily basis touches upon only the fact of what occurred. The constant repetition tends to make the extraordinary commonplace, something as routine as the daily reports of highway accidents. According to media briefings, this is what happened. Some extremely wealthy terrorists, generally assumed to be bin Laden, planned and carried out through his agents a series of notorious acts of terrorism which resulted in a huge number of casualties and exerted an unprecedented effect on people the world over. Just what, in sum, did the mastermind behind these terrorist acts achieve? A significant part of the world community, on the head of state level, united against him. The most up-to-date technology and well-trained military units were employed to capture and destroy him. According to the official version, terrorist number 1 is hiding out in caves in the Afghan mountains. These mountains have been bombed from the air, along with Taliban forces, considered as collaborators with the mastermind. The developed countries, led by the USA, have joined forces to put an end to all the camps of terrorist organizations, no matter what country such camps are located in. Could the mastermind have failed to foresee the subsequent development of events? Sheer nonsense. Of course he knew that it would happen precisely that way. For a man able to evade capture by the special forces for such a long time, to plan and carry out terrorist attacks requiring serious analysis and calculation, it should not have been a difficult task to calculate the course of events which followed. Thus it turns out that this mastermind, from one point of view, is an astute strategist and tactician capable of meticulous analysis, while from another standpoint he is an utter fool. It turns out that through his terrorist activities he has brought doom upon himself, his organization, and all terrorist organizations, even those not connected with him. The situation is utterly illogical, and consequently the actions of the world community in the struggle against terrorism may not be effective. And if the full truth be told, dangerous, since logic dictates that the mastermind behind a terrorist act remain above suspicion. Be that as it may, one thing is clear. The picture of events that emerges from the facts reported in the mass media is a highly illogical one. In the beginning, of course, I, like many other people, didn't pay much attention to this, but the news from America immediately resurrected in my thoughts several of Anastasia's sayings which I had decided to refrain from publishing because of their strange and extraordinary nature. But now, after what happened in America, these same sayings explain a lot, though it didn't become clear right off, by any means. Here's one example. Right from the time of the Egyptian pharaohs, the rulers of states, both large and small, have been the least free people on the earth. They spend the greater part of their time in artificial information field, compelled to submit to accepted rituals of behavior. They constantly receive a tremendous amount of routine and monotonous information, but time constraints do not allow them to analyze even that. If a ruler should make the transition from an artificial information field to a natural one, even for just 3 days, this is something dangerous for all levels of priesthood. Dangerous, too, for the ruler's secular rivals. The danger lies in the possibility that the ruler might start analyzing a whole range of processes on his own, thereby freeing himself from the yoke of occult influences and freeing his people from them. A natural information field is nature at large, its appearance, fragrances, and sound. It is only the nature of one's own domain, a place where flora and fauna treat man with love, that can protect man from occult influences on him. Now, as I sat at my desk, made of the cedar wood which Anastasia had given to me, I recalled these words, though this time they no longer seemed strange to me, as they had before. Indeed, look at what is happening, even with our President of Russia. He is constantly meeting either with foreign heads of state or with officials from our own country. None of them just stop by to take tea. They come with all sorts of problems and are impatient for immediate solutions. And the press? No sooner does some sort of unusual event happen in the country than immediately the press wonders what the president's reaction will be. Or more bluntly, why didn't the president himself go to ground zero? And he wins approval ratings when he actually visits the place where a flood or something else happened. But is that a good thing? And when does he have time to calmly think about and analyze the information coming in? Give us the president, the people demand at the moment something occurs. That's the way it happens. That's the way it's scripted. But what if it were scripted another way? The president should not be dashing off in all directions like a firefighter. He shouldn't be briefing officials, wasting time on meetings. It is essential that he be given the opportunity to sit in his own garden, and from that perspective follow what is going on in the country and then analyze the incoming information. And from time to take some kind of decisions. Perhaps then the people too would start to live better. What kind of nonsense is that? Many might react, as I did at first. Nonsense? But it is normal not to give someone the chance to think. But is it normal not to give someone the chance to think? Indeed, there is someone who finds it very profitable for the presidents of various countries to think as little as possible. What would happen in our country if our president were given uninterrupted time to quietly think about things? What if he were afforded the opportunity to step out of the artificial information field, at least for a time? And all at once I was struck by a thought which made me feel as though an electric current was running through my whole body. All at once I could feel my desk warming up. An incredible stroke of intuition hit me. For some reason in my excitement I grabbed the telephone receiver and without dialing any numbers, since she doesn't have a telephone, I cried into the mouthpiece, "Anastasia." There was no customary dial tone, and a moment later I heard a familiar voice, easily distinguishable from all other voices in the world, the calm, pure voice of Anastasia saying, "Hello, Vladimir. You should try not to get so excited. You see yourself what unnatural actions excessive excitement can lead to. I shall not talk with you on the telephone. Please calm down. Get up from your desk and go out into the fresh air, into the grove of trees near your house." The dial tone returned. I put the receiver down. Wow, I thought. I really did get stirred up. I wonder whether that was really Anastasia talking to me, or was I just hallucinating from excitement? I really must go outdoors into the fresh air and calm down. A short time later I got dressed and went out into the grove of trees next to the house. Deep in the grove I caught sight of her. There was Anastasia standing under a pine tree just by the side of the pathway and smiling. Not paying any attention to her extraordinary arrival, I began talking immediately. Who saved America? Anastasia, I've got it. I did some analyzing, comparing your sayings with the events which took place in America, and it all became clear. Listen to me and correct me if I'm wrong. The series of terrorist acts which occurred on the 11th of September in America, it wasn't complete. The organizers were preparing something a lot bigger, weren't they? Of course they were. Only I can't fill in the details. In general, I think I've got it, but the details? Can you help me here? I can. Then tell me. The mastermind behind this was counting on 6 terrorist groups to act in succession. Each of the 6 groups was to act independently at its appointed time without knowing anything about each other, and their leaders did not know who was behind it all or what the ultimate goal was. Each group was made up of religious fanatics, ready to die for the cause. Only one group was comprised of people who had agreed to carry out the dirty deeds for money. The first group was to simultaneously seize control of all civil aircraft in the skies over the country, as well as those taking off from airports and those approaching American airspace. All the seized aircraft were to be used to destroy targets of national importance. 6 days prior to this, another group was to infect the water supply system in 20 major hotels. The plan was drawn up in such a way that it would be virtually impossible to trace the source of the infection and the location of the perpetrating agents. Each agent was supposed to take a room in one of the hotels, place a special device on the cold water tap, and open the tap. Instead of water flowing from the tap, the air pressure would force a deadly powder back into the whole system. After this, the tap would be shut off, and the following morning the perpetrator would be making his way to a hotel in another city. The bacteria released into the water supply system would become glutinous upon contact with the water, sticking to the sides of the pipes, swell up, multiply, and flow downward. In 12 days they would have proliferated a great deal. In an ordinary, natural water setting, they would be incapable of proliferating. They would be destroyed by other bacteria. But such a balance is absent in an artificial supply system, where man has deprived the water of many of its natural properties. During peak consumption periods, when people would be washing themselves in the morning, for example, the water flow would cause a part of the bacteria to come loose, and contaminated water would come out of the tap. People washing themselves would feel nothing at first, but after 8 to 12 days, small abscesses would appear on their skin at an increasing rate. They would grow in size and suppurate. The disease would be highly infectious and very difficult to cure. Though the attack organizers possess an antidote, A lot of people would be infected in many countries. Soon it would be discovered that these people had all stayed at hotels, but this would become evident only after the planes crashed. It pains me to talk about the wretched deeds to be carried out by the other perpetrators. The net result of all the acts of terrorism taken together were designed to produce a climate of panic and dread. Many people would begin leaving the country, taking their families with them. They would attempt to relocate their capital to banks in land where they considered it less dangerous to live. But not every nation would agree to accept refugees from the USA. Most countries' populations would be gripped by fear and terror, especially if what had been considered the most powerful state in the world could not cope. Stop, Anastasia. Let me try to guess. After that, masterminds would announce themselves, put forward their demands through some kind of intermediaries. Yes. But they didn't succeed in carrying out all the attacks they had envisaged. They didn't succeed in wholly frightening Americans. They didn't manage to do everything they had planned because they were forced to start acting quite a bit before they were fully prepared. That's how the illogicality arose. The terrorist acts took place, but they did not follow through with any demands. The whole process got cut off, and I think I can guess why. Because the real masterminds are to be found among the priests who are alive today. And they were frightened by Bush's actions and were obliged to jump the gun, right? Yes, they... Wait, Anastasia, I've got to understand this for myself. I've got to learn how to understand. This is very important. If I can get it, that means others like me will be able to discern the reality we live in. That means everybody will understand that what must be done to better our lives. Yes, Vladimir, if you have been able to understand, other people will too. Some right off. With others, it will take time. But people will start building their lives in a splendid reality. Go on. Only a little bit more calmly. There is no need to get so emotional about it. But I've almost got myself calmed down now. Or maybe not. This is hard to talk about without getting emotional. But hey, the President of America, Bush, has really stirred things up for those smart asses. I realized how horrified they must have been when President Bush all at once upped and left for his ranch in Texas. Just 6 months after taking office, the president takes a holiday and goes away for close to a month. And where does he go? Not to some fashionable resort, not to some exotic castle. He goes to his ranch, where he has a small house. Even the usual lines of presidential communication are missing. All he's got there is one very ordinary telephone, and no proliferation of TV channels, seeing he hasn't got a satellite dish. The media commentators mentioned these facts, but nobody realized what was behind them. I read on the internet everything I could about Bush's trip to his ranch. Just the fact was stated. They were surprised that he took a holiday so early in his mandate, and for such a long time. He spent 26 days at his ranch. He didn't allow any press people to visit, and didn't invite a bunch of officials. Nobody understood. Here was George Bush, the President of the United States of America, taking a colossal step, which not a single president had ever taken before in the whole history of the country. Maybe not a single ruler has ever thought of doing something like that over the past 5,000 or 10,000 years. You are right, they have not. The beautiful thing is that for the first time the ruler of a huge country, the most important country in the world, much to the horror of all the priests, suddenly tore himself away from his artificial information field. He simply picked himself up and left it behind. And with that he came out from under the control of the occultists. Now I understand. Rulers are always kept under control. Their daily pronouncements are vigilantly followed. Follow down to their intonations and facial expressions. Their actions are subject to correction through all kinds of information tossed their way. But when Bush escaped from that field, they were horrified. They tried reaching him through occult means, the way you put it, through remote voice commands. But that didn't work. They didn't reach him. Just as you said, do you remember? You said that nature, the flora and fauna, constituted the natural world, and it does not permit harmful occult influences to reach man. It protects man, provided he has made contact with the natural world, the one he has created himself. Yes, that it is, exactly. George Bush, of course, evidently did not create what was growing on his ranch. But he was the one who selected the location. He treated it with love. Love for the nature there, which is obvious from many facts. And nature reacted to his love. It responded to him. It protected him in the same way as the vegetation growing in one's family domain. Is something like that possible, Anastasia, when someone hasn't planted things himself, yet they still react? It is possible. Sometimes they will react when man treats his surroundings with sincerity and love. A similar thing happened in the case of George Bush. So there, I was right. Here was the president on his very own ranch. Everybody thought he wasn't receiving any information, but in actual fact the flow of artificial information from the artificial world significantly lessened, and the flow of natural information from the world around him significantly increased. The president took it in through the rustling of the leaves, the splashing of the water, the singing of the birds, and the whistling of the wind, and he meditated. He analyzed. He thought, this fact is something they will try to wipe out, to forget, or to refrain from talking about. They will try to change the subject, but they won't succeed. Bush will still go down in millennial history. I've got it, Anastasia. Of course, one can say a lot of intelligent things and write a lot of songs and poems, like King Solomon did in the Bible. Or one can act more radically and convincingly like Bush, and thereby say to the world, look here, people, I am rich, I have supreme power over the strongest country in the world. But none of this is the most important thing for man's being, man's soul. Man's soul, along with its divine essence, prefers something else. Not an artificially created world, but the natural world created by God. My ranch is dearer to my soul than gold and technocratic achievements. And that is why I am going to my ranch. You too should be thinking, people, about your aspirations in life. The American president has come up with the best, the strongest, and most convincing advertisement for the family domain you spoke of. The future family domains of Russia, of the whole world. If people don't understand it after this, then mankind really is asleep. Or just about everyone is under somebody's hypnosis. And that's why they're sick and in agony. That's why they use drugs and go to war and kill each other. If mankind doesn't come out of this hypnosis after your words, after Bush's actions, then it's going to take a disaster. Bush is the president. He's the most informed person in our technocratic world. Since he has access to information from special services and various think tanks, and he is aware of the information offered by the natural world, he can do comparisons and analyses. He did this and showed with his actions. Wait, another incredible coincidence. No, a whole series of coincidences. If indeed they are coincidences, you were saying. You say things, and they come to pass. You told me that at the start of the new millennium, the Russian president would pass a law concerning the land to grant every Russian family a hectare of land, free of charge. Well, on the 21st of February 2001, all the TV news programs carried a report on a session of the State Council of Governors under the chairmanship of the Russian president, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. The session looked at the land question, specifically private ownership of land, including farmland. The various governors assembled had different opinions on the question. The majority of regional leaders, members of the State Council, were in favor of making land available to Russians as private property. Judging by his remarks and his address, as well as by the fact that he was the one who had put the land question before the State Council, it appeared that the president was also in favor of allocating land to people as private property with the right of inheritance. And so the upshot of the session was a directive to the government to prepare draft legislation on the land issued by May of 2002 and presented to the State Duma for consideration. Of course, they're talking about selling, not giving the land away for family domains. And farmland isn't even on the table, but all the same, it's a palpable step in the right direction. Who is for, who is against? Upon entering the flat, Anastasia took off her cardigan and kerchief, letting her golden hair fall to her shoulders. She gave her head a light shake, and the flat was at once filled with the enchanting fragrances of the taiga. I took a chair and put it next to my own armchair by the desk, turned on my computer, and logged onto the internet. Not all people in Russia today will know what that is, and so I shall give a brief explanation. The internet is an electronic information network, or web, which has been developing at an intensive pace in many countries of the world. With the aid of a computer, one can tap in or log on to this network through a telephone line connected to a server. A server is a special, powerful computer containing all sorts of information pages. On most servers, one has the opportunity of posting one's own messages. The Anastasia Foundation for Culture and Assistance to Creativity, based in Vladimir, together with the Moscow firm known as Ruski Express, Russian Express, has also set up its own server and its own site at the address anastasia.ru. Thus, any readers with a computer can type in the address on their keyboard and not only visit our site, but they can send us an electronic message expressing their opinion about the books, find out what other readers have said about them, and argue or discuss any particular question. Those that do not have their own computer can gain access to our website through one of the internet cafes which now operate in all regional and provincial centers of Russia, as well as, I am sure, in most major cities. From time to time, I too log on to the internet and look up what my readers have been saying. I have not been able to do this very often, as I simply have not had time to respond to all the correspondence I receive by regular mail. And last year, the Anastasia RU site received more than 14,000 postings. People discussed concrete questions connected with Anastasia's ideas on family domains. They suggested draft changes to the Russian Constitution. Some were thinking to hold a referendum on this issue. The substance of Anastasia's idea about granting every willing family no less than 1 hectare of land on which to organize a family domain was set forth in appeals to President Putin more accurately and with more cogent backup arguments than I had expressed in my own appeal, published in the book Who Are We? In any case, you can judge for yourselves. For those readers without internet access, I am reproducing here an excerpt from one of the appeals. Open letter to the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. Dear Vladimir Vladimirovich, over the years, the Soviet power, which even today many of us still remember as the best years of our lives, a most frightful thing, happened. We, the citizens of this great country, Russia, historically a mighty power, which emerged victorious from this terrible Second World War, and in an incredibly short period of time was able to build up its war-ruined economy. We transformed ourselves, without our even being aware of it, into weak-willed parasites and welfare bums. Look back. In Soviet times, we all went to work without ever worrying about a job opening, and received a stable salary on which we could lead a normal life. We handed over our children to be schooled and were assured of their future. We knew that upon reaching retirement age, as we as pensioners would receive a stable pension and quietly live out our years. And this stability, this mighty totalitarian system, played a dirty trick on us. Having got accustomed to social passivity, social apathy, and indifference, and now no longer enjoying access to a stable source of income, we have begun to get very upset. You see, we did not start to take action or improve our lives. We just started vilifying and railing like the blazes at the powers that be. Each president and each government in turn, blaming them and them alone for our present situation. After all, we figure it is up to them to pay us a stable salary and take care of our present and our future, while we simply live our lives for our own pleasure and do nothing to support this stability and prosperity. I think you will agree that when there is movement only in one direction, that is parasitism. If all we want to do is receive and give nothing in return, well, that's parasitism for you. And now something amazing has happened. Thousands and tens and thousands have risen up under the impulse to make something happen. To create a splendid, flourishing corner of their motherland, Russia. To create a splendid present and future for themselves and to their children. To create their own material and spiritual prosperity. To create Russia to be the wealthiest and most flourishing country in the world. And for that, these people need nothing more than a small plot of land, a mere hectare in size, along with the assurance that this land will not be subsequently taken away from them, their motherland, where they will create forever a space of love for themselves and their children. A space of love which will be comprised of all the flourishing corners of our vast Russia and proclaim to the whole world the great miracle, the Renaissance of Russia the Great. It seems to me that even now in Russia a situation has come about that any ruler, you can call him a president if you like, might dream about. A situation where people themselves desire to work and create their own material and spiritual well-being, asking nothing from the state except a plot of land and a sign of stability expressed in law. Isn't this the dream of any state, to open up an inexhaustible source of wealth and well-being within itself, to find stability within itself and independence from external troubles? Dear Vladimir Vladimirovich, like thousands of other Russian citizens, I should like to affirm once more my intention to create my little corner of my motherland, Russia, to make it a flourishing garden for many generations of my descendants. Like thousands of other Russian citizens, I hereby reaffirm my intention of laboring for the good of my family and for the good of my motherland. Like thousands of other Russian citizens, I have stopped unthinking and relentlessly criticizing either you or our government, realizing the complexity and responsibility of your work. Like thousands of other Russian citizens, I believe in your wisdom and far-sightedness, and I am confident that you will take a responsible approach to appraising our current situation. The time has finally come for you and us to work together as a fraternal team, a team of like-minded thinkers, for us to understand and accept you as a close friend, and then you will feel our love and support and look after us, too, with love, as the people entrusted to your charge. And together we shall create a splendid present and future for our children, for our Russia. The 20th of July, 2001. They defamed our forebears, too. One day, on my computer, I opened up an internet search engine which lists all the various websites containing any keyword you type in. I typed in the word Anastasia, and the monitor immediately lit up with an impressive list. 246 Russian-language sites, together with links to their web addresses. Still not believing that they all related to the Siberian Anastasia, I began following the links and familiarizing myself with the content of these pages. It turned out that the vast majority of them did in fact discuss at varying length the Siberian Anastasia. Her ideas were treated favorably on many of the sites. At first I was delighted by this, but as I delved deeper into the volume of information available on the internet, I began coming up against an even more incredible phenomenon. Several of the sites offered a selection of articles from the press, along with anonymous messages claiming that the movement associated with Anastasia was a sect, and all the readers of the books were categorized as sectarians. One of the sites featured a list, either full or partial, of the existing sects in Russia, and the list included Anastasia and her supporters. There was no mention of the basis for such a conclusion, or of who was spreading such rumors. They were simply set forth as though they were a given fact that apparently everybody had known about for a long time. The articles and brief comments from various national and regional publications posted on different websites were very similar to each other, and they always came to the same conclusion, that the Ringing Cedars of Russia movement was either a sect or a business. The Anastasia movement was lumped in with such sectarian organizations as Aum Shrinrikyo and classified as a totalitarian sect, They even used words like bigots and destructivism. No concrete facts were cited, just the conclusions, and that was it. Not knowing the exact definition of the word totalitarianism, I looked it up in my great encyclopedia. Totalitarianism is one of the forms of domination, characterized by its complete control over all spheres of a society's life, along with the virtual liquidation of constitutional rights and freedoms, also by repression of political opposition and dissenters. For example, the various forms of totalitarianism in fascist Germany and Italy, or the communist regime in the USSR. Now that's pretty steep. What they're saying, in effect, is that I, or Anastasia, have been in control of some flashy totalitarian sect, ready to overthrow authority, abolish constitutional freedoms, and institute a fascist regime. But I categorically deny that I have had any governing role in any kind of organization. All the more so in the case of Anastasia. Throughout the past 6 years, I have been working exclusively on my books, and once or twice a year I give talks at readers' conferences which are open to anyone who wishes to attend. My talks have been recorded on tape and anybody can have access to them. But why, for what purpose, and by whom is this bald-faced lie being spread abroad? In one of the newspaper articles, this one in the Vladimir region supplement of Komsomolskaya Pravda, it says that in the Anastasia books, readers are encouraged to give up their city apartments and go off into the woods. How can that be, I thought. After all, Anastasia says the exact opposite. Here are her direct words. There is no need to go live in the forest. You need to clean up the place you have been polluting first. And she calls upon people to build their family domains near big cities and gradually change their lifestyle to one more civilized and more favorable to one's soul and physical health. Not having the opportunity to personally review the tremendous amount of information, let alone analyze it, I turned to several well-known experts in political science to examine the situation independently of each other and draw their conclusions. Each of them asked considerable compensation for their work, given that they had to read through all 5 books, plus the huge amount of information connected with the books which had been posted on the internet. I had no choice but to accept their terms. 3 months later, I received the first experts' conclusions, and not long afterward the remaining reports. Even though they expressed their findings in different words, since they did not know each other and were working independently, they came to pretty much the same conclusions. I shall cite a few typical excerpts from one of the reports. There is a whole, targeted, clearly formulated campaign directed against the Ringing Cedars of Russia series of books, with the aim of preventing the spread of these books among the population at large. The pivotal ideas of the books are the strengthening of the state, the achievement of the greatest possible unanimity in the various social strata of the population through the well-being of each individual family. This condition of well-being is achieved by virtue of each willing family being allotted no less than 1 hectare of land for lifetime use. In the context of the books, this idea is the most persuasive and takes precedence over all others. Consequently, the series' opponents, whatever the argument they put forward, are in fact denouncing this particular idea. The next question raised by the Ringing Cedars of Russia series, the divine nature of man, his spiritual origin, may provoke animosity on the part of many religious denominations. The book's main heroine declares that man's existence in paradise should be built here on earth and by man himself. Man is eternal, only changing his fleshy form from one century to the next. Our whole natural environment is created by God and comprises his living thoughts. It is only by making contact with nature that man can comprehend what God has programmed, and the substance of his purpose for man on the earth. This whole concept, the reasoning behind it, and its extreme persuasiveness cannot fail to provoke opposition, especially among religious fanatics who believe that the end of the world is inevitable and that some people will be transported into a paradise beyond the clouds while others are sent to hell. Such a concept is favorable to many people who have been unable to make their own life happy during their existence here on earth. The opposition to the ideas of the series' main heroine, Anastasia, is being affected by the circulation through the mass media of rumors that its readers, who have taken the initiative to put a number of the projects suggested by the books into practice, belong to some sort of totalitarian sect. This approach is quite deliberate, inasmuch as it serves to distance the authorities from contacts with enterprising readers and from examining their specific proposals, as well as from discussing the problems raised in the books in the mass media. It also serves to interfere with the circulation of the books and the ideas put forward to them. It should be pointed out that the opposition has achieved their aim. According to reports on hand, claims about the readers belonging to a sect are being circulated in many government agencies. The specific objectives of the opposition are not clearly presented. They remain quite enigmatic. As a rule, when candidates competing for office use dirty tricks in their campaigns, it is easy to guess who is instigating them. Similarly, in the economic sphere, when individual firms are competing for business, it is not difficult to determine who is behind a smear campaign and why. The goal is always clear, to knock off or weaken the competition. Anastasia talks about a new consciousness for man, a new way of life, establishing the state on a more perfect foundation. Who would oppose an aspiration like that? Only forces interested in the destruction of individual families, states, and society as a whole. The existence of such forces can be traced through their conspicuous opposition. In this case, in launching actions directed at Anastasia herself and her ideas, as well as against the readers of the Ringing Cedars of Russia series. To all appearances, they are acting through agencies either directly or indirectly under their jurisdiction, as well as through individuals. I showed Anastasia isolated excerpts from the discussions of the subject on the Internet, and I read her the experts' conclusions, in the hope that the situation portrayed would somehow move her or rouse her into taking corrective action. But Anastasia continued sitting quietly beside me on her chair, her hands resting on her knees, her face showing absolutely no concern. On the contrary, it even betrayed a little smile. "What are you smiling for, Anastasia?" I inquired. "Doesn't it bother you that they are all slandering your readers? The fact that they are blocking their initiatives to obtain land for the family domains." "I am delighted, Vladimir, by the inspired impulse on the part of so many people, by their understanding of the essence and significance of what they are undertaking. See how thoughtfully they are setting forth their thoughts and drawing up plans for the future. And the appeal to the President is better than the one you formulated in your earlier book, as well as they're making plans to hold a conference with that wonderful title, Choose Your Future. It is very good when people start reflecting on their future. They certainly are making plans, Anastasia, but don't you see how their plans are being thwarted? What a tricky move someone thought up, to call them all sectarians, striking fear into the population and discouraging administrative bodies from contact with them. Don't you see that?" "I see it, but there is nothing new or sophisticated in such opposition. The same approach was used to destroy the culture, lifestyle, and knowledge of our forebears, and now the dark forces are using the old methods again, and they will even come up with provocations and then spread frightening rumors. This has happened before, Vladimir." "Exactly, this happened before, and they won. You said yourself, they destroyed the culture of our forebears. They distorted history. That means that now, too, using a tested method, they will win again, if they haven't won already. Hey, just a simple question, like granting every willing family a hectare of land. It's been impossible to solve for a year now. It would have been okay if they had asked for that hectare for something obscene, but it's impossible to get land for the purpose of organizing one's family domain for normal living conditions and supply of food. Those refugees that have been living in tent cities for more than 3 years now, if they, at least the ones who wanted it, had each been given a hectare of land, by now they could have turned it into a decent human place to live. I've thought quite a bit, Anastasia, about what colossal changes could take place in our country if only the authorities would not oppose but help people aspiring to create their own domains. But such a simple little question regarding the allocation of land is not being solved. Glad tidings. This question is far from simple, Vladimir. It actually involves major changes on our planet and in the universe. When millions of happy Earth families begin to consciously transform the planet into a flourishing garden, the harmony reigning on the Earth will have an effect on other planets and the whole space of the universe. Right now, the planet Earth is sending a poisonous stench into the cosmos, and more garbage is piling up in orbit, and a malicious energy is radiating from the direction of the Earth. A different energy will be emitted when there is a change in the conscious awareness of Earth dwellers, and then the grace emanating from the Earth will bestow flourishing gardens upon other planets. Wow, how grand! And has there never been such an opportunity before in human history? After all, in Russia, back before the revolution, landlords had their family estates, and now in many countries there is private ownership of land. We have farmers, too, who rent out land for extended periods, but nothing comes of it. Why not? There has been no conscious awareness, the kind that is growing today in human minds and souls as little shoots of the divine. What you call the straightforward question, Vladimir, during the occult millennia, was the greatest secret held by the priests. Many religions through the ages have talked about God, but not one of them has ever stated the obvious. In consciously communing with nature, man communes with the divine thought. To understand space is to understand God. And even the thought or the dream of a family domain where everything is in harmony with you embodies much more closeness to God than a whole lot of convoluted rituals. All the mysteries of the universe will be unfolded to man, and all at once man will discover within himself capabilities that he cannot even imagine today, and man will become truly godlike, the man that begins to create the divine world around him. Think, why do not wise men ever mention this anywhere? All because once man understands his earthly essence and his capabilities, he will become free from occult spells. The power of the priest will disappear. Nobody and nothing will ever have power over a man who has created a space of love around him. And no harsh and threatening judge will the Creator be for such a man, but rather a father and a friend. This is why, through the centuries, they have come up with so many tricks to turn man away from his purpose. Land, such a straightforward question, you say, Vladimir. But think about how centuries have passed and man still does not have family land of his own. You were mentioning farmers and landlords, but with their family domain, they hired other people to work the land. They have endeavored to get as much profit as possible out of their land. People who did not work the land themselves could not treat it with love, and often seeds were sown in the ground in anger and malice grew. For thousands of years, simple truths have been hid from the people. Other people's hands and thoughts should not be compelled to touch one's family land. In different ages, rulers have offered people land allotments, but in such a way that the meaning of their earthly deeds has not been clear to people. If a man is given just a small piece of land, a quarter of a hectare, for example, his family will not be able to build an oasis there, which will serve him effortlessly. A large tract of land is too much for a man to govern independently, and he will end up hiring helpers, thereby involving other people's thoughts. So people have been drawn away by trickery and chicanery from what is important. Does this mean, Anastasia, that not a single religion over thousands of years has ever called upon people to create divine oases on the earth's land? On the contrary, they have spent all their time calling people's thoughts away from the land, somewhere else. So it turns out that they... Vladimir, do not say unflattering words about religion. Your spiritual father, the monk Feodorit, led you to where you are today, and it is largely thanks to him that you and I met in the first place. The time has come today when congregations of all the various denominations need to think about how to save our spiritual leaders from disaster. What kind of disaster? The same kind that happened in the last century, when people sacked the temples and put ministers of various faiths to death. You mean under the Soviet regime? But now, you see, we have democracy, freedom of religion, and the authorities treat all religions, or at least the major ones, with respect. How could the events of bygone years all at once repeat themselves? You should take a closer look at what is happening today, Vladimir. You know that many countries have joined together in the struggle against terrorism. Yes, they have pointed their finger at other countries as the ones promoting terrorism, and they have publicized the names of the instigators. They have accused, among others, some spiritual and religious leaders, and special forces have been assigned to hunt them down. But that is only the beginning. Reports have been given to the leaders of countries both large and small, exposing the nature of many religions, and they include a whole lot of examples of how these religions themselves were responsible for fomenting acts of terror and war on the earth. In these reports, which have already been prepared, analysts have set forth everything accurately and convincingly. Information about many terrible crimes will now gradually come to light. They will remind people of an endless succession of wars like the Crusades, intrigues, perversions, and greed among the ministers of the occult. When anger builds up in a whole lot of people, pogroms may be launched in many places, and these may include the destruction of temples. At the moment, clerics from a number of religions are trying to put a stop to religious extremism, making declarations to the effect that the extremists have nothing in common with them. Indeed, these clerics openly condemn extremism. For the moment, these declarations are being accepted, or rather, the political leaders feign ignorance and say they are satisfied with the declarations. In the meantime, these secret reports are already claiming that religions are programming people, using any kind of pretext. The pretext may be well-intentioned, calling the faithful to good works, for example, but any faith in something a man cannot see, especially one which he accepts unquestioningly as truth from a preacher, is always fraught with the danger that the thoughts of the programmed believer may be redirected at the will of the preacher. And so today's believers may easily be transformed into tomorrow's suicide bombers. And a whole lot of different facts from both past and present are cited in the reports as evidence in support of this conclusion. Before long, the rulers will become inclined to the opinion that they should select one religion and put it completely under their control, at the same time declaring all others harmful and deserving of elimination. Subsequently, if they do not succeed in drawing all the people into one religion, then the next step is to destroy all religions, at least within their own borders. Such a decision will lead to a never-ending war. This war has already started. It is already going on. It must be stopped. And this can only be done in one way, by giving birth to a conscious awareness on the part of our spiritual leaders. Only glad tidings can restore peace to all the earth. Those that accept the glad tidings and proclaim them in temples both great and small, they will fill the temples with multitudes of people. Those that do not perceive the sayings will find themselves in temples that are empty and decaying. What glad tidings are you referring to, Anastasia? Can you explain it a little more simply? People who call themselves spiritual leaders, who talk of God and teach children in schools today, should recognize as a God-pleasing deed the co-creation of a space of love in the personal domain of every family dwelling on the earth. Not only to recognize this, but to create designs as well for future projects together with their parishioners, to endeavor, along with the people, to bring back the knowledge of the pristine origins, to dream and discuss such a theme, and then to bring the design to perfection in all its detail. The process of creating the dream will take many years. Then, when all this comes to prevail upon the earth, people will live in harmony, in a real divine space of love. I've got it, Anastasia. You want everyone to begin studying nature in all the temples of whatever religious persuasion, and in the schools and in institutions of higher learning, to master the science of creating a family domain according to a special design. Let's say this can actually bring various religious denominations together into a common alliance, not just in words, but in deeds. Let's suppose it could really awaken people from their hypnotic sleep, put an end to terrorism, drug use, and a whole lot of other negative tendencies in society. Let's suppose, but how will you be able to convince all the patriarchs and all the clerics, and in so many different denominations. How will you be able to convince all the secular educational institutions? A lot of things you say come true, Anastasia, but what you're talking about at the moment is completely unfeasible, sheer pie in the sky. It is feasible. They have no other choice now. But that's just what you think, just you. These are mere words, what you're saying. But the one who allows me to utter these mere words, as you put it, possesses power unsurpassed. You may remember, back 7+ years ago, back when you were still an entrepreneur, that I stood before you and drew letters in the sand by the lake in the taiga. Yes, I remember, but what of it? And then all at once you began to write books, and now a whole lot of people are already reading them. Who do you think was mainly responsible for this? The sand by the taiga lake? Or the stick I drew with? Or the words I articulated? Or perhaps your hand created the books all by itself? And later poetry welled up like a sacred spring in human hearts. Who was the chief creator behind these works of art? I don't know. Possibly all the factors played a part. Believe me, Vladimir, please try to understand. It is his energy that stands behind everything that was created. It is his energy that inspired human hearts, and it will continue to inspire them. Perhaps, but somehow it is hard to believe that church ministers will start to act the way you say. You should believe in this, and visualize a gladsome prospect within yourself, and then it will come to achievement. All the more so, since that is no longer hard for you to do. You remember how an Orthodox village priest came to you to cheer up your crestfallen spirits. Another priest paid for your books with his own money and then distributed them to the prisons. And your father Feodorit talked with you about a lot of things. Do you remember? I do. And you should realize, too, that not all church ministers share the same world views. There are those who will proclaim the glad tidings. Yes, I think you're right, but there will be others who will begin to oppose them, especially the high priest you spoke about. His occult agents will think up some kind of new intrigue. Of course they will, but all the dark forces' endeavors will now be in vain. The process has begun, and it has already attained the point of no return. People will learn first-hand of their earthly paradise. These are mere words, you will say, but here I shall now utter 2 simple words, and a part of the darkness will be illuminated with light. Let the rest of the darkness tremble and begin to conceal their names, as they fail to win the possibility of turning into reality. And these words are utterly simple. The Book of Kin. Chapter 10. The Book of Kin. Yes, the words are certainly simple, all right, I observed. And just why are all the forces of darkness supposed to tremble at hearing them? They are afraid of what is behind the words, replied Anastasia. Do you know who will write this book, and how many pages it will have? How many, and who will write them? Just a few days go by, and millions of fathers and mothers in many a land will be writing the Book of Kin, filling in it its pages with their own hand. There will be a vast multitude of them, these books of kin, and all of them will contain the truths which begin in the heart for their children. There will be no room in these books for artifice or guise. Before them, all the lies of history will fall. You can surmise what would happen, Vladimir, if you could take into your hands today a book which your ancestors of old had begun to write especially for you. Then another would continue the writing, eventually your grandfather and your father and your mother. The book read by man today include many that are devised with a specific aim in mind, namely the distortion of history and the meaning of life. Many false dogmas are especially designed to distort man in space. This is not easily discernible all at once, but clarity comes directly a son reads a book of his forebears, which his father and mother have continued personally for him. But wait, Anastasia, not everyone knows how to write a book. Everyone can if they feel the demand to do so, if they are looking to protect their children and in the future themselves from false dogmas. In Vedic times, every father and mother would write a book of kin for their future children and grandchildren. This book was not comprised of words, but of deeds. Children could read created space like a book, and understand the deeds and thoughts of their parents, and were happy to inherit a happy space. Only one thing was missing from that book. Children were not alerted to the world of the occult. It was not part of the complete awareness of the omniscient Vedans. Now that all mankind has been able to detect in their own experience the devastating influences exerted on themselves by the occult dogmas, they will certainly be able to protect their children from them. Even if there are not yet any domains to bloom in the spring, thoughts about them are already alive in many human hearts. They need to start writing a book precisely about their thoughts for their children. And why, Anastasia, does every parent need to write? Look, I've written books about domains, and an architect from the suburb of Medvedkovo is working on a design for a whole settlement. Besides, there is a flurry of internet discussions on the subject. Isn't that enough? It is not enough, Vladimir. Take a closer look with what has been going on. You have been writing books, but other people are writing books too to counteract yours. There are so many books that a man could not hope to read even half of them over his lifetime. And look, there is a daily flow of information to man that does not come from books. And even though it seems very diversified, all that information really comes down to the same result. It justifies and glorifies the unreal world of the occult. What can help the newcomer to the world determine where the truth and where the falsehood lies? The holy temple of the family will help in this, the Book of Kin. In it, a mother and father will write for their son and daughter about what is the most important thing that needs to be created for happiness in life. The children will continue to record the Book of Kin. There will be no wiser and truer books for families anywhere on the earth. All the knowledge of their pristine origins will be poured into it. But how, Anastasia, how can knowledge of one's pristine origins turn up in a book which people are only beginning to write today? Where are they to find such knowledge? You said that the culture of our forebears, their books were all destroyed. Those that will begin to write already have this knowledge concealed within themselves. It is preserved within each one of us. When people think deeply and begin to write not just for anyone, but for their children, all the knowledge of their pristine origins will be revealed within them and come to light. So that means that before they start to write, they first need to think, so that wise thoughts may be set forth right from the very first pages of the book. The first pages may be outwardly very simple. Can you give me some examples? When was the man who began to write this Book of Kin born? What was his name? For what purpose and with what thoughts did he take a pen in hand and approach the pages of this important book? And what did he plan to create in the future? Such a book, I observed, would be easy to begin for anyone who, let's say, has been a famous artist, or a governor, or a scholar, or a die-hard entrepreneur. But what about someone who has simply lived a life? Say someone's been working and can barely make ends meet. He scarcely earns enough for food and clothing. What could he possibly write for his children? What advice could he give them? The rulers of today, and those who bask before the public in rays of glory, and those who have accumulated a whole lot of money, will find it difficult from now on to have an answer for their children. People quickly forgot their deeds of yesteryear, but what a man has contributed to his future will be appreciated by future generations. Are you or anyone else in the habit of recalling past governors, famous artists, or entrepreneurs? Not very often, or rather, I don't really think about them at all. I don't even know their names, but children will take great pride in remembering what their parents did, and their children will try to forget. They will be ashamed just at the mention of their parents' names. Why should the children be ashamed? Because fate offered their parents such great opportunities, but they could not grasp the fact that fate is affording us opportunities only, invariably for the purpose of creating the future. In his one lifetime, man should be endeavoring to create the next life for himself, a life in which he can embody himself anew and live forever. Every man can even today plan out a domain and a space of love. They can create their design and try to obtain the land. They can use that land to plant a few saplings or plant seeds of family trees. Perhaps they will not be able to grow to maturity, say, a whole grove or a green hedge or a splendid garden in their lifetime. Perhaps a poor old man will not even be able to lay a foundation for his house, but he will be able to write in the book of kin for his grandchildren, for his children. I was poor. It was only in my old age that I began to think of the meaning of life, on what I have handed to my children, and I have created a plan for a space for our family. I have described it for you, my children, in a book. I have been able to plant 9 fruit trees in the garden, as well as just 1 tree in the spot where a grove will grow. The years will flow on. The grandson will read that book and remember his grandfather. He will go up to the mighty majestic cedar or oak growing amidst a lot of other trees on the land of his kin's domain. His thought, overflowing with love and gratitude, will soar into space, will merge with his grandfather's thought, and then a new place of being will be born for both of them. A whole life in eternity is afforded to man. The settling of the earth and the planets of the universe is nothing more than a transformation for each man within himself. The Book of Kin will help convey the glad tidings to one's descendants, and help the soul of the beginning writer to once again embody itself upon the earth. Well, Anastasia, you attach such importance to this book that I too have the desire to start writing one for my descendants. I have the intuitive feeling that in this idea of yours about the book is something most unusual and grand. Wow, that's quite a name. The Book of Kin, the Kin's Book, the most holy book for the family. But what should it be written on? Ordinary paper will soon yellow and disintegrate, and the bindings on notebooks and albums tend to look rather primitive. After all, if the book is destined for one's descendants, if, as you say, it is such great importance, then the paper and the binding should correspond too. What do you think? What should be used? That kind, for example, and she nodded in the direction of a book lying on my desk. I followed her gaze, and a moment later I was holding something quite extraordinary in my hands. Some time ago, a man named Sergei from Novosibirsk had sent me a copy of my Anastasia. The customary publisher's binding had been cut off, and these pages transferred to another. I was going to say binding, but that's not the right word for what these pages had been put into. A Siberian craftsman had created an extraordinary work of art. The whole cover, including the spine, had been made out of a valuable species of wood. The edges were of beech, with cedar inside the frame. All the details were decorated with finely carved ornaments, text, and illustrations. One could hardly apply the ordinary term cover to all this. The term casing would probably be more appropriate. The front and back parts were fastened together on one side by the spine, on the other by a little lock. All the little parts were finely fitted together. When the book was closed, the pages were evenly positioned between the front and back parts of the casing, thus preventing the paper from buckling under conditions of either high or low humidity. The pages would not flutter even from a draught of the air, in contrast to some of other books which I put beside for comparison. Many visitors who saw this work of art would hold it for a long time in their hands, looking it over carefully with joyful admiration. Following Anastasia's gaze, I took the book with the wooden casing into my hands, felt its warmth, and began to understand. Perhaps it was thanks to this extraordinary work that I really understood the tremendous significance of the Book of Kin Anastasia had been talking about. She sat there meekly on the chair beside me, her hands modestly resting on her knees, but I got the feeling that she was wiser than all the priests and dynamic leaders right from the ancient times, wiser than our modern analysts, and through her wisdom and purity of thought she's able to overcome all the negative manifestations in human society. Where did these capabilities of hers come from? What school or system of child raising can endow man with such abilities? Wow, what an unusual, incredible step to think up. A book of kin. I couldn't stop myself from letting my mind get carried away, and just look at what a grand thing she's come up with. Nobody has so far been able to counteract the flood of various kinds of suggestions which has been rushing at people in different countries minute by minute. First and foremost at our children. Suggestions? Our TV features a constant parade of action films, supposedly for the purpose of public entertainment, but in fact demonstrating how splendidly man can provide for his financial well-being through violence. Suggestions? How great it must be to be a famous singer, to bask in the spotlight and the applause, to gad about to receptions in luxury limousines. Suggestions? If it weren't for the power of suggestion, they would also need to show other, considerably longer segments from the life of these people, the most challenging everyday work routines, the never-ending intrigues instigated by entertainment rivals, the never-ending attacks by jealous wannabes, not to mention the paparazzi hoping to make money on the backs of celebrities under the so-called freedom of the press. One particularly monstrous suggestion comes in the form of aggressive and sophisticated advertising, which is ready to promote anything as long as you pay the money. Suggestions, never-ending news about all sorts of international do-good foundations coupled with wonderboy politicos, and people are left with the impression that it is only thanks to our politicians that they can live a warm, fed, and cozy in their homes. And then, when the radiators go cold, people no longer bother asking themselves questions about how they can change their lives, how they can become independent of central heating, electricity, and water supply. Instead, they rush madly into the streets and shout, "Give me!" a suggestion of their own helplessness. Such false dogmas are being suggested to adults and children alike. Children? How can we talk about raising children as long as we parents just stand on the sidelines? First, we entrust the delivery of our children to strangers in an unfamiliar medical institution. Then we allow strangers to teach them in kindergarten and school. Then we allow them to be exposed to a plethora of explicit or disguised pornographic literature on our store shelves. We allow strangers to recommend books and textbooks to our children to read. We allow strangers to produce TV programs for them. Who finds it profitable to hold the whole system of child raising in their hands? Maybe that's not the important question. Maybe what's more important is our feeling of utter helplessness and insignificance. We feel we're totally incapable of putting a stop to such lawlessness. But this isn't true. Any parent can do it, if only he wants to, if only he thinks about it. The Book of Kin. What a super idea. The end of lawless commercial suggestions. What lawlessness may still flex its muscle and show off a little. But it won't be long before man takes in his hands the Book of Kin, and finds there written, by the hand of his grandfather, grandmother, father, and mother, a statement of man's purpose in life. We, today's parents, shall certainly be able to figure out what this purpose is. Most definitely. We are experienced. We've seen, heard, and gone through a lot already. We only need to pause for just a wee bit, turn away from the flood of suggestions, and think for ourselves with our own heads. For certain, every parent must think about this by himself, only by himself. There's no point in looking for answers to questions on the meaning of life in books of wisdom from past centuries, no matter how celebrated or promoted these books are. And there's no point in seeking answers in the works of wise men whose reputation is thousands of years old. These wise men were great preachers and messiahs. They endeavored to preach and leave writings for future generations. But there is not one, not even one of these great works that we shall ever see. They have been most cleverly destroyed. This can be clearly understood if one but stops and thinks. Just look and see what a difference it makes. How switching a single comma around in a brief sentence can change the whole meaning of a message. Remember the famous example, execute never, show mercy. Execute, never show mercy. And how many similar alterations have crept into the works of the ancient thinkers, either deliberately or inadvertently, at the hands of copyists, translators, publishers, and historians. And we are talking here not just about changes in punctuation, but the deletion of whole pages, whole chapters, and writing of one's own interpretation. The result is that we today are living in some kind of illusory world, Mankind is constantly at war. People keep destroying each other like hell and can't understand why wars do not stop. But how can they stop if mankind has not even once been able to determine who has been instigating these wars? It hasn't been able to because there has been no independent thought, and without independent thought, it accepts suggestion as truth. Who started the Second World War? Who fought with whom? Who won? The whole world community is convinced that the war was started by Hitler's Germany, under Hitler. Victory was achieved by the Soviet Union under Stalin, and these half-truths, or rather delusions, are accepted by the majority as absolute, unequivocal historical facts. And only a very few historical researchers occasionally mention Hitler's spiritual mentors. For example, the Russian Lama Gurdjieff, acting through Karl Haushofer. Hitler had one other spiritual mentor, Dietrich Eckart. Historians know of contacts these spiritual mentors had with their superiors, part of a more elevated hierarchy. But at this point, nobody any longer mentions names. Researchers say only that they have traced connections to the Himalayas and Tibet, as well as both open and secret occult societies existing at the time in Germany, and confirm Hitler's participation in them. Germany witnessed the rise of organizations such as the German Order and the Thule Society. The latter's emblem was the swastika, together with a wreath and a sword. Someone was clearly and deliberately shaping their own unique brand new ideology in Germany, inculcating in its population a specific type of worldview. The upshot was large-scale war and masses of human casualties, followed by the Nuremberg trials where Hitler's cronies were tried. But those who appeared before the court were ordinary soldiers. Even if they happened to be generals or field marshals, they were still soldiers, including Hitler himself, foot soldiers to the unseen priests who shaped the ideology. He, the chief strategist and organizer, was not even mentioned in the trial records. Who is he? Who are his closest secret associates and assistants? Is it all that important to know about them? It is important, extremely important. After all, it is they who masterminded the war, and as long as they are allowed to remain in the shadows, they will start it again. With their growing experience, new wars will be even more sophisticated and on an even more massive scale. What were these people really after, the masterminds behind the Second World War? Perhaps an examination of the following fact will bring us closer to solving the mystery. For the Nazi ideologists in Germany at the time, there was an organization known as Untitled, which collected ancient books from all over the world. In the first place, they were interested in old Russian editions of the pre-Christian period. One can trace a rather bizarre chain: the Himalayas, Tibet, lamas, secret societies, all leading to the relentless hunt for the knowledge of our forebears from the pagan Russia. We Russians saw no need to preserve these manuscripts, but someone else found them to be a vital necessity. Why? What secrets did this knowledge harbor within itself? Secrets which evidently had much more of an edge to them than anything known to the Tibetan monks. But how to gain access to even one of these secrets? Just to one. And if it turns out to be significant, then what kind of lost world might open up to people today if a few more, or indeed all, of them should be revealed? But where and in what millennia should we look for an answer? Rome, ancient Rome. Something extraordinary happened there 4,000 years ago, more extraordinary than the exploits of the Roman legion. Oh yes, that's it, an incredible discovery. The Roman senators were the highest elite group of that period. They were slave owners, but all at once they began to give their slaves, who were skilled and desirous of growing crops on the land, they began to give them land, for their lifetime use with the right of succession. Funds were allocated to a slave's family to build a house. A slave's family could not be transferred to another owner without their land. The land, became an inseparable part of the slave's family. But what suddenly moved these slave owners to such a humane and altruistic act? Was it purely from kind and noble motives, or did they receive something in return? What they received was 10% of the harvests for their table. That is probably the smallest tax of the whole known period. This begs the question, why did the Roman elite do such a thing? After all, the slave owner could have simply ordered his slaves to work in his fields by the sweat of their brow and take as much of the harvest as he wanted. But no, why? Because back in pagan Rome they had still hung on to the Vedic knowledge, and the patricians and senators knew that the same product grown by a slave on land other than his own would differ sharply from its properties from that grown on his own ground and raised with love. Back then they still knew that everything growing in the ground carries in itself a psychic energy. To be healthy, one must feed oneself with lovingly grown produce. This was mentioned in several ancient books in the Alexandria Library, which was destroyed. What further knowledge, what wisdom was lost along with these books? Anastasia says that it is possible to resurrect this knowledge and all its attendant wisdom, beginning with their pristine origins within oneself. Everyone has the ability to do it. I want to believe that statement, but I'm still not fully convinced. Where can we find proof that such a thing is possible? What facts can we draw upon from memory so that we can fully accept what she says? Are we to remember everything we heard from our father and mother, or that we were taught in school, or read somewhere over our whole lifetime? But our recollections still do not contain any significance or absolute proof. What if I could remember everything I was told by Father Feodorit? But he didn't say all that much. He spent most of the time listening, and while he did give me some ancient books to read, there was no evidence in them. Then how can modern man suddenly unfold within himself this treasured knowledge of his pristine origins? He can. No doubt there exist characteristic examples and proof in the recollection of every man. In my own recollections, I did come across one. A good and attentive grandmother. My grandmother was a witch. Not a fairy tale witch, but a real, actual white witch. Oldsters, perhaps, will remember her incredible marvels. She lived in Ukraine, in the village of Kuznichi, in the Gorodnya district of Chernigov region. She was called Efrosinia, and her last name was Verkusha. On one occasion, when I was very young, I was present at one of her miracles. Back then, I hardly understood anything about them, but now it has all become crystal clear to me. Oh God, what simplicity there is in the most puzzling, incredible phenomena. I have an idea at least half of the population today, especially the healers, would be able to freely duplicate her results. To provide a few more details, here is what happened. All my early childhood I spent in the Ukrainian countryside in a small white straw-covered hut. I loved to watch my grandmother busying herself about the stove. Once, after a scuffle with one of my classmates, someone taunted, "Your grandmother's a witch." Other kids started to defend my grandmother, saying, for example, "My mommy says she's a good woman." On a number of occasions, I saw how my grandmother treated people's physical ills. I didn't attach any particular significance to it at the time. After all, there were many healers in different villages back then. Some had better success treating one particular disease, some another, and nobody was called a witch. But my grandmother's abilities did not fall under the usual healing methods. It turned out that my grandmother, who was only semi-literate, easily cured many animals. She did this by a method that seemed at first glance incredible. She would disappear for a day along with the sick animal, and by the time she returned, it would have made a full recovery, or at least a partial one, in which case she would instruct its owner on how to continue the treatment. When I heard my classmate insulting my grandmother by calling her a witch, even though children are generally afraid of witches, I did not begin acting any worse toward my kind grandmother. On the contrary, she, or rather her actions, only awakened a greater fascination in me. One day, the collective farm chairman's horse was brought to my grandmother. It was a purebred recently bought for the chairman to travel about on his daily business. We local kids always admired this particular mare when the chairman happened to ride by. The mare held her head high, and her gait was friskier and more elegant than that of the other horses in the area. But this time she was brought to grandmother, not harnessed to a wagon and not saddled. She was being led just by the bridle, looking very downcast and moving very slowly. This was a rare event for me, the chairman's horse right in our yard. I began following the proceedings with considerable interest. Grandmother walked up to the mare and began stroking her, first from one side on her muzzle, then around to the ear, all the while quietly whispering soothing words. Then she unbridled the mare, taking the metallic bit out of her mouth. Carrying a bench out to the yard, she laid out bunches of herbs on the bench, then brought the mare over to them and began offering the animal various dried herbs in turn. With some of them the horse didn't pay any attention and turned away, while others she sniffed at and even took a small taste of them. The bunches that caught the mare's attention grandmother threw into a water-filled iron pot which was standing over a coal fire, and finally dropped her nightcap into the mixture. I heard her tell the people who had brought the horse to come the day after next in the morning. After the people had left, I realized that grandmother was once again getting ready to disappear somewhere altogether with the mare, and I started pleading with her to take me along. Grandmother, who had always granted all my requests, did not refuse this one either, though she did stipulate one condition. I was to go to bed earlier than usual that night. I obeyed. Grandmother awoke me at dawn. The mare was standing in front of the house. She was covered with a small piece of canvas. After washing my face with the mixture from the iron pot, grandmother gave me a small bundle containing something to eat, then took hold of the rope lead which she had fastened to the horse's bridle. Presently we set off along the border between the garden plots in the direction of the little forest that started just beyond. We walked very slowly along the edge of the forest. To be more specific, grandmother walked alongside the mare and stopped each time the mare bent her head down to the grass to taste some kind of herb. Grandmother held the lead so loosely that it even slipped out of her hands whenever the mare, having spied something in the grass, jerked her head sharply to one side. Occasionally grandmother would still keep on leading the horse further, but after coming to a new place she would once again give her free rein. We kept walking, either along the edge of the forest or just a little ways in. It was already past noon when we came to a mud hole in the middle of the field. We sat down by a haystack from the first hay cutting for a little rest and a bite to eat. After snacking on milk and bread, I was tired from our long trek and felt like sleeping. On top of it all, grandmother took out her bundle, a small sheepskin coat, spread it out beside the haystack, and encouraged me. "Lie down and have a rest, little one. I guess you must be pretty tuckered out." I lay down and began to fight off sleep, fearing that grandmother might magically disappear along with the mare and without me. But sleep won out. Upon awakening, I saw grandmother picking some sort of herbs right next to the mare's muzzle and sticking them in her bundle. Not long afterward, we started heading for home, but a different way this time. As it began to get dark, I again felt as though I needed a rest, and once more grandmother put me down on the sheepskin coat. When she woke me up, it was still dark, and we continued once more on our homeward journey. From time to time I could hear grandmother saying something to the mare. While I don't recall the contents of her words, I clearly remember her voice intonations, soothing, tender, and cheerful. When we reached home, grandmother at once began to give the horse water, adding the mixture from the iron pot to the pail. Later I saw her give the people who came for the horse the bunches of herbs she had picked during our walk and explain something to them. The mare, who had by this time become a little friskier, was reluctant to leave our yard. She had already been harnessed again and kept turning her head to look at grandmother, pulling on her lead. For several days afterward I was angry at my grandmother for not showing me how she could magically disappear like a witch. But the whole time she had just kept on feeding the horse, picking herbs and tying them into bundles. I might have soon forgotten about the walk and the witchery, but when I told the boy who had called her a witch that my grandmother didn't disappear anywhere, but simply fed sick animals, he was just a bit older than me, cited a significant fact that neither I nor any of the village kids who were on my side would counteract. Why is it, then, that each time the chairman rides by your yard, the horse stops trotting and goes by just at a walk? She doesn't even obey the whip. I don't remember how grandmother explained this to me. It is only now that I understand the reason. I am confident that a lot of people today who have kind hearts and have an attentive relationship to nature and animals could also treat creatures' ailments the way she did. Now I realize that she allowed the horse to try bunches of various herbs simply to determine what specific herbs the ailing animal required. She also used this to decide the route she would take the next day, counting on finding these herbs along the way, and at the same time replenishing her own stock. She needed to make this a whole day's trip, since each plant has a particular time when its consumption is especially beneficial. She held the lead loosely so as to allow the mare to determine for herself which herbs and how many she needed to take in. Animals can feel this in an inexplicable way. Since the mixture was prepared from herbs chosen by the mare herself, grandmother's use of it for washing, as well as letting her nightcap soak in it, was probably to make the animal more predisposed to her. See how simple everything turns out to be? Only it's still not clear to me how all this was known by my semi-literate grandmother. Oh, how we have complicated this simplicity. May that not be the reason for the large-scale epizootic mad cow disease that recently swept across Europe? And our modern scientific thought came up with nothing better than to destroy thousands of diseased animals. I have cited just one example attesting to the fact that the achievements of our modern medicine are illusory. Indeed, I could cite a whole lot of similar examples of the illusory achievements of our contemporary society, but why talk of specific details when we could go right off to the main thing? To live in a marvelous reality. What kind of society are we living in today anyway? What are we striving for? What do we suppose we can build in the future? The overwhelming majority of the Russian population will answer without hesitation. We live in a democratic state and are striving to build a free democratic society, just like the developed civilized Western countries. That is exactly what the majority of politicians and political strategists will say. That is exactly what they say on TV and in newspaper columns. That is exactly what the majority of people in our country think. That majority opinion exactly confirms Anastasia's statement that a part of the people in our modern civilization are asleep, while the rest, because of their programming, are mere biorobots in the hands of a bunch of priests who imagine themselves to be the rulers of the world. If one could just stop and withdraw oneself even a little from the world's feverish, daily, monotonous commotion, and think independently, it should be possible to understand the following facts. Democracy? Just what is democracy anyway? What concept does the world itself denote? The majority will answer by quoting the well-known great encyclopedic dictionary, or the dictionary of the Russian language, both of which offer pretty much the same terse definition. Democracy is a form of political system or social order in a state, based on the recognition of the people as a whole as the source of authority. The basic principles of democracy are the authority of the majority, the equality of citizens. And in highly developed countries, people choose their parliaments and presidents by majority vote. Choose? Utter nonsense, a complete illusion. There are no choices or elections. Not once, not even in a country which considers itself the most democratic and civilized on the globe. Have the people themselves ever held power? But the elections, they are a complete illusion. Remember what always happens before elections in any so-called democratic country. Teams of political strategists working for each candidate fight among themselves, spending huge sums of money and sophisticated methods of psychological influence on people through the mass media, TV, and graphic promotional campaigns. And the more highly developed the country, the more sophisticated the technological methods of suggestion employed. It is clearly evident that the victory always goes to the team of political strategists that can exert the most influential and the greatest power of suggestion. It is under the influence of this suggestion that people go and vote. They think they are voting by their own will. In fact, they're merely carrying out somebody else's will. And thus it turns out that modern democracy is an illusion of the masses. It is their faith in an unreal social order, an unreal, illusory world. It all boils down to this: subordination to the majority does not exist in the natural world. All the groups of plants, animals, and insects may be subject to instinct, the movement of the planets, the order established by nature, or the leader of a herd. And in human groupings, it is always the minority that is in control. It is not the majority that has fomented revolutions and wars, but the majority participated in revolutions and wars at the consciously directed suggestion of a minority. That's the way it has been, and that's the way it is now. Democracy is the most dangerous illusion people have been exposed to en masse. It is dangerous because in the democratic world it is only too easy for any democratic country to end up being ruled by one person or a small group of people. For that, all they need is a pile of money and a good team of psychologists and political strategists. And we, today's parents, living under the influence of illusions, are still trying to raise our children. But in actual fact, what we are doing is introducing, pushing, one might say, their consciousness into a world of illusion. We are in fact handing them over into somebody else's clutches, only not to God. We are handing them over to some kind of opposite of God. God's world is not illusory. It is real and beautiful. It has its own unsurpassed fragrances, colors, shapes, and sounds. The gates to this world are always open, and we are always free to enter, if only we can shake off the illusions that have been fettering our consciousness. I too shall write my own book of kin for my descendants, indeed for myself, and among other things I shall most certainly write the following. I, Vladimir Megré, lived in an age when mankind did not exist in the real world. Their flesh fed on the gifts of the real world, but their consciousness wandered in a world of illusion. This has been a very challenging period in people's lives. Right now I am attempting to bring my consciousness back to the real world of the divine. The divine world of nature has suffered at the hands of people's consciousness, suffered terribly. I realize this and am trying to correct the situation. I will do whatever I can, even if it is only creating a design for my domain. Perhaps even just part of it. The main thing is to understand and have my children understand. As before, Anastasia sat quietly by and listened while I vented my reasonings aloud. When I stopped, she got up, walked over to the window, and observed. The stars are beginning to twinkle in the sky. It is time for me to go, Vladimir. You are right in many respects, but be careful not to let these new visions of reality make you want to control others. Get the better of such temptation, and do not join any organizations. Other people, too, are seeing this reality. Once they have organized, they will bring about a significant achievement on the earth. You will understand your own destiny in life. I'm not aiming to join anything or control anybody, Anastasia. But what is this destiny of mine you speak about? The time will come when you feel this for yourself. Right now, lie down in the bed, go to sleep, and rest. You are excited. It is possible that an untrained heart will not be able to withstand such excitement. Yes, I know. But if I go to sleep, you will go away. You always do. Sometimes I have a strong desire for you to stay and not go away. I want you to be always beside me. I am always beside you. Whenever you think of me, you will soon begin to feel and understand this. Now wash yourself with water and go to sleep. I can't sleep. Lately I haven't been sleeping all that well. My thoughts have been keeping me awake. I shall help you, Vladimir. Would you like me to read some of the poetry your readers have sent in and sing you a lullaby? Go ahead and try. Perhaps I really shall nod off to sleep. After I washed and lay down in my bed, which had already been made up, Anastasia sat down beside me and placed her hand on my forehead. Then she ran her fingers through my hair and softly sang a song written by one of my readers from the Ukraine. Anastasia sang very softly, only it seemed that many people and the stars in the sky were listening to her song, listening to her pure voice and her words. Take my hand this hour, tomorrow you will see, is another day, but now you can press your cheek to me. Thus, hour after hour, you may sleep in sweet relief, for from your strands of hair I'll gather up the grief, and I shall spread a blanket fine, blue with stars all woven. I shall stay a long, long time, just so you won't get frozen. If only you'll receive me, from the night I'll come and stand. All throughout the ages, I've learnt to heal ills by my hand, which all pain assuages, if only you'll believe me. Down from a high incline, past us stones will tumble. I know ahead of time where you're going to stumble. Into church and palace you'll go, a hero bright. All the pretty lasses I shall keep from your sight. In a world of black and white, I too will live unimpeded, so that the swords and bows drawn tight will never be more needed. If only you, if only you, if only you will love me, I'll let the loyal sparrow fly up and teem with crane in the heavens above you. I dare not come into your dream, too tenderly I love you. Before immersing myself in a deep and calm sleep, I managed to think, of course, tomorrow is another day. It will be better. I shall describe the dawn of a brand new day, and many people will start writing in their books of kin about how a splendid new beginning has been dawning on mankind. And these will be the greatest historical books for their descendants for thousands of years of time. And one of them will be mine. Tomorrow I shall start writing a new book, and now I shall be able to give a more coherent sounding design. And the new book will define a new historic turning point for the people of the earth, a turning to the marvelous reality of the divine. Until we meet again, dear readers, in this new and marvelous reality. Vladimir Megré, to be continued. Translators afterward. Suppose you've lived all your life in the same town at the base of a huge mountain. You've looked at that mountain day in and day out, as you walked to and from school, plowed your fields, shopped at the outdoor market, or cycled around its town on errands. You are familiar with every detail of its craggy surfaces, and on occasions have even climbed up part way to explore the foothills. But you have never been round to the other side. Then, one fine day, you decide to take the night train to a town some distance away, about a quarter of the way around the mountain, where the local residents speak a completely different dialect from yours. Upon arriving the next morning, you set out to take a look at the mountain from this side. And there it is, looming just as large, just beyond this new town. Only at first it doesn't look like the same mountain at all, even though your angle has changed by a mere 90 degrees. What was familiar from a frontal view you now see in profile. Features you knew before in profile are now facing you head-on. Some of these features require a closer examination to identify. In fact, many of your fellow residents who made this trip before you and didn't bother to examine the scene in detail say the mountain here looks nothing at all like the one back at home. Some of them refuse to believe it's the same mountain. A few even associate the unfamiliar appearance with something hostile and threatening. Such impressions are further fueled by the different way the locals describe the mountain in their own dialect, either with completely different words or using the same words but with different connotations. Indeed, the terminological discrepancy is rather disconcerting at first. But little by little, the more you examine these features in detail and even try a bit of climbing exploration, the more you become convinced that you are dealing with the same mountain you have known all your life. And as you hear the local residents speaking about it, you gradually acquire the ability to translate between their dialect and yours, and you realize they are talking about the same concepts you have known all along. In some, you find yourself simply amazed at what you are learning about a familiar landmark from a brand new perspective. That does not necessarily mean, however, that you have any plans to suddenly relocate your residence, but you are certainly able to make use of your new knowledge to enhance your appreciation and exploration of the mountain from your own home base. This little story pretty much describes my experience in approaching Vladimir Megré's Ringing Cedars series. Having been raised in the Protestant denomination known as Christian Science, though I am sure people of many different faiths have had a similar experience, I'm amazed, even blown away, by the new vistas of Mount Spirituality that opened up to me from my initial reading of the series. At first glance, like the mountain in the story above, some of the features, especially those given new names or whose names were interpreted differently, presented something of a recognition challenge. But the more I read, the more I realized I was not being presented with a new God or even a new religion, but simply with new views on the same God and spirituality I had known all along, only from a different angle. And these insights have indeed enhanced my appreciation and exploration of spiritual concepts from my own faith's home base. One particularly striking example of being blown away by a new view of familiar territory was my initial reading of Chapter 1 in the present volume, Who Raises Our Children, which seems to pick up right where Mary Baker Eddy's chapter on marriage in Science and Health leaves off. Not only that, but a friend of our family's, a Catholic writer on theology, told me a number of instances where intimate relations have been linked to a more spiritual outlook, including certain practices among Orthodox Jews and native peoples of North America. She also referred me to the book of Tobit or Tobias in the Apocrypha for an additional illustration. These examples, however, while fascinating, differ from the approach outlined in Chapter 1, in that their attention is still concentrated on the physical act of intimacy, albeit seen from a more spiritual standpoint. While the principal focus of Megré's discussion with the psychologist is children, the physical conditions playing but an incidental role. Another group that has much in common with Anastasia's viewpoints on life are the Doukhobors, a sect that was persecuted in Tsarist Russia for their pacifism and opposition to the dictates of official church hierarchy. In 1899, they were helped to emigrate to Canada by the writer Leo Tolstoy, who recognized in them a living embodiment of his own simple, straightforward approach to a Christianity of the heart without ecclesiastical trappings. This past year, I had occasion to present a conference paper entitled Links Across Space and Time, the Life and Works of Leo Tolstoy, Mary Baker Eddy, and Vladimir Megré, pointing out some of the many similarities not only in the ideas of these three spiritual thinkers, but also in their personal and professional lives. As specific examples, the paper compares similar statements from all three writers on the subject of life and prayer. I have no doubt that the comparison could be extended to include some other spiritual thinkers too. Indeed, to me, one of the most remarkable features of Megré's whole account of Anastasia and her sayings is its sense of inclusiveness. Megré does not purport to take his readers into another universe, where all the worthy values they have held dear for so long must suddenly be regarded as worthless and forsakable in favor of some new doctrine. He is not presenting them with a new mountain. Rather, he is simply showing them the spiritual values they already have from a brand new point of view, thereby enhancing the significance of these values and helping his readers put them into practice more effectively. As a translator, I was delighted to find that this sense of inclusiveness embraces not just the people and their values, but the whole underlying foundation of language as well. Often seen as a divisive element in human society, in the Ringing Cedars series, particularly the present book, language becomes a unifying force as fragments of its ancient roots are uncovered, enabling us to trace equivalent words in different languages back to their common origin. At the beginning of Chapter 10, footnote 2 on the name Medvedkovo explains that medved, the Russian word for the animal we call a bear, is comprised of the roots med, honey, and ved, no. Surprisingly, both these roots have their counterparts in English. Mead, an alcoholic drink made from fermented honey and water, and wit, an obsolete word meaning no, now more commonly used in the sense of quick understanding or the ability to play intelligently with words and their meanings. Historically, knowledge and sight were related concepts. We see, therefore we know, and hence words like video and vision can also be traced through Latin videre, to see. back to the same root, as can the word white, something clearly seen. These examples show some of the many layers of meaning inherent in the original root. But even more interesting, as my editor, Leonid Sharashkin, has pointed out to me, is the realization of how these linguistic changes reflect the evolution of the underlying concepts in human consciousness. In both Russian and English, and roots ved and wit have yielded in general usage to zna and no, respectively, indicating mankind's greater interest today in superficial technological knowledge than in the multidimensional awareness and wisdom implied by the earlier terms. In fact, with some of their derivatives in both languages, e.g., vedma, witch, the original positive reference in this case to someone capable of harnessing the extended abilities of the human mind has given way in popular perception to a more negative connotation of one who uses such abilities for devious or evil purposes. Like many Russian roots, Ved comes directly from Sanskrit along with Latin, one of the two proto-tongues from which the whole Indo-European family of languages is derived. And this highlights another aspect of inclusiveness evident in this series, namely certain indications that language transcends mere human invention. Hence, its great potential for unifying instead of dividing the peoples of the earth. On a visit to Russia in the 1960s, renowned Sanskritologist Durga Prasad Shastri discovered remarkable similarities between present-day Russian and the Sanskrit spoken in India some 25 centuries earlier. In fact, his knowledge of ancient Sanskrit enabled him to understand spoken Russian well enough that he could get by without an interpreter. And this is one more illustration of how Vladimir Megré, through relating Anastasia's sayings on mankind and its history, brings together people of not only different religions and cultures, but also of different chronological periods, to recognize and embrace their common heritage as children, not of different genetic backgrounds, but rather of the one universal God. Perhaps the author's future volumes will not only show us still new views of our familiar mountain, but transform our whole perception of a mountain into a dimension we cannot yet fathom. Think of how a mountain seen from space may resemble, let's say, a cedar nut. Then imagine how what we see as a mountain of spirituality might be perceived through spiritual vision itself. The possibilities are endless. John Woodsworth, Ottawa, Canada, December 2006. Read to you by Nicole, September 2019.